All right, I'll go ahead and hit start webinar, and I think it'll let everyone that's in the waiting room in, and then it's all y'all.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I'll go ahead and start. Well, I know people are still might be coming into the meeting. We just opened it up, but I wanted to go ahead and welcome everybody and thank you for joining our biweekly forum here at Kirwan. We're excited to host this conversation today with Dr. Melissa Crum, and we're happy to have you, that you've all taken the time out of your day to join us. We meet here every day, every other Thursday from 11 a.m. to 12:15 p.m., although some of our speakers may stay afterwards if they can to answer a few more questions. So why are we here on a webinar? Well, due to the pandemic, we've moved our forum to this online webinar format in order to promote public safety and to make our forums more accessible to people. Just a few notes about this new format that we feel you should be aware of. First, everyone except the forum presenters and Kirwan staff are muted in terms of audio and video, so you don't have to worry about having to mute yourself or deal with any video settings or anything like that. No one will be able to hear or see you except anyone except our speakers and ourselves. Also, the chat feature sometimes is disabled, but sometimes isn't. But we are encouraging people to make use of the Q&A button to ask questions or raise concerns about the webinar. Lena or I will go ahead and answer those as we can. If there are questions about the presentation, we usually save those until after the speaker has spoken. Let's see, at that time, somebody from Kirwan can collect questions and ask them to presenters for Q&A if there are a lot, or the presenter might just decide to pick questions. Finally, this webinar is being recorded so that we can make that available through our social media afterwards. Though no one except the presenters will be recorded, we wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that ahead of time, just for the sake of transparency. So with that said, today we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Melissa Crum from the Mosaic Education Network. And she's going to be talking today about, I know I'm going to get it wrong. Well, I'm going to let her talk about what she's going to talk about today. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Crum.
Awesome, thank you, thank you. So happy to be here. Thank you for having me. So I have this tendency of using every second that I'm given. So I'm going to jump like right into it. So today, we are talking about Race and Identity Definitions Toolkit for Educators. Now, just to be clear, this is not an exhaustive list. This is like some heavy hitters, you know, to get our kind of feet wet, if you will, in thinking about how people are thinking about themselves when it comes to race and other kind of racialized identities. So as was stated, I'm Dr. Melissa Crum with Mosaic Education Network. I'm a diversity, equity practitioner. So I'm an artist, author, researcher, and oftentimes I utilize creativity, art, and storytelling in my workshops. We won't be doing any art today. I know you came here ready to do some art, and I know you're sad about that, but we're not doing it today. Maybe next time, you know, bring it to your community. We can do some real creative stuff, start thinking about some complex topics. But today I'm just giving you some straight, direct information. I am a Buckeye 2 times. I'm also from the University of Florida. And so all these experiences come together, all this information, my past experiences trying to share some ways in which can convey that information. So I've worked with a lot of organizations across the country. I enjoy working with learning and cultural institutions to help them think about workplace culture and ways of understanding. But really my favorite people to work with are teachers. I really like working in K-12 schools and helping them think through how they're thinking about their students, because our children are spending most of their time in school. You think about they're spending most of their day with teachers. And although maybe everybody on this call are not K-12 teachers or maybe not even educators, I am keeping educators, of course, in mind as I'm sharing these different definitions. So I want you always to be kind of contextualizing that in a classroom where you're always engaging with these little human beings who are primed for shaping their mindsets. So today's objective is to have a shared language and make connections to current national issues. Like start thinking about how that shows up, but also thinking about how that can show up in your classroom. Strengthen the awareness at the intersections of identity, so multiple identities together, and in order to have more inclusive decision-making processes and really start thinking about ourselves and the people around us in the most complex ways possible. Also to have more tools to engage in reflective conversations, thinking about how am I thinking about other folks, and also being a little bit more critical, have critical thinking and problem solving approaches to have enhanced relationships. So let's jump into these definitions. So I'll tell you a story about a time I was a master's student. And I was working with a particular high school English teacher. And that was just kind of supplementing some work activity. And so she was in the front to the side grading papers, and I was leading a particular activity. So in the middle of this activity, this young man just kind of storms into the classroom, sits down and puts his head on the desk. And so I was thinking, okay, well, I will just have a conversation with him later once I finish presenting the activity. When students are working independently, I'll go have a conversation with him. Well, the students started getting a little rambunctious, if you will. So they're talking amongst each other, but not in a productive way. And I'm trying to get them kind of back together, and it really wasn't working. So the teacher that the classroom I was in, her name, we'll call her Miss Smith. So she then yells, "Dewan and all you guys need to be quiet." And so the young man that sat up, the young man that came in late and put his head on the desk, sat up and said, "Why are you always talking about me? I didn't even do anything. Like, you always got something to say to me. I wasn't even doing nothing." And so I first was thinking, okay, we're just going to pretend that didn't happen, and I'm going to continue with this activity. That didn't work. Students were definitely now disengaged. And so I decided to take one of the desks in the front of the classroom and turn it around to look at the students, and I asked, what just happened? And one of the young women said, well, Miss Smith said Dewan was talking and he wasn't even talking. And I said, okay. I said, Dewan, what just happened here? And he says, repeated similar to what he said earlier. I wasn't even doing anything, y'all. She always got something to say. She always got something to say to me all the time. And so I said, what if I gave you a greasy paper bag? What would you do with it? And he said, well, I throw it in the trash. I said, okay. What if I gave you a velvet box? What are you going to do with it? And he said, I'll open it. And I said, what if there were diamonds in both of those things? And I said, my point is, you sharing the fact that you were dismissed, that you were incorrectly grouped with folks who were being disruptive is an injustice, and you should share that. That's fair. The challenge is, it's in this greasy paper bag, right? The way in which you communicated this information. And like, what happens if we start thinking about packaging our diamonds in velvet boxes? Now, I said, this is the problem here, because there's an unfair expectation that you, as a child, should always be delivering your injustices in velvet boxes. And so what happens, what's unfair, is that there's a full adult running this classroom who can't dig through a greasy paper bag to see the diamond that you're trying to share. And that's not your fault, but it's unfortunate that you have to experience that, right? That you have to kind of manage your feelings so someone else won't have their feelings in response to yours. So Dewan was surprised. You know, he was excited in a way that more like, maybe excited is too strong of a word. He was grateful, right? You could see him relax. He felt validated. I was happy. I feel like I taught this teachable moment. Kids like have an understanding about communication, like really thinking about how am I saying different things. I can't control how somebody's going to respond to me, but I can now be thinking about these types of things. But Ms. Smith, on the other hand, she was extremely hurt. She went to her principal and said that I was critiquing her curriculum, which I was not. She asked me for feedback, and she was incredibly defensive. So administration told me that I should write a formal apology to Mrs. Smith. Well, I wrote something like an apology. And at this time, as a master's student, I had read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Freire. I suggest all educators read it. And so I wrote this letter, which I call the Pedagogy of Freedom, right? And in this letter, I said, is anyone going to question Mrs. Smith's relationship with her students? Dewan continued to say, she is always calling me out. And he wasn't doing anything, like literally, he wasn't doing anything. His head was on the desk. He was not engaged, like he was doing nothing, right? So he wasn't, but why she keeps targeting him in particular? Who else is feeling that kind of way? Is anybody going to challenge her perspective? So she said, I did all these different things, but nobody asked me if I actually did those things. So who's going to ask her these tough questions? Did anybody ask why Dewan came in and was upset in the first place? Like what happened right before class? Is anybody going to ask Dewan about his relationship with Miss Smith? Like how is that jeopardizing his academic experience if he's feeling targeted every time he goes into that classroom? Maybe he was upset with the fact that he had to go to that class. Maybe he wasn't there because he was trying to skip that class. Why was that? What exactly am I apologizing for? Essentially what I said in this letter. What did I actually do wrong? And particularly, like, why am I at fault? And why am I, the master student here, the person who's supposed to be helping and learning, and the person who's asking these questions and not the people with the most power in the room and in this building? So I ended this letter with this quote. Some people have developed theories about teaching inner city youth, and most of these theories are predicated on preparing these youth to participate in the mainstream, while never questioning the sanity of joining a system that has systematically oppressed and exploited the very youth we are teaching. If we are preparing them to be productive citizens, if preparing them to be productive citizens is the bottom line of what we do, then we might as well be teaching courses in suicide. I don't apologize for my stance. I advocate for education for liberation and not education for mainstream socialization. And this comes from an educator and artist out of New Orleans. And so I want us to be thinking about how the stories that we have for our students and the people around us, how those can be used, because we read those stories internally, whatever story that we have for folks, that they can be really short, they can be long, they can be simple, they can be complex, but we really want to be thinking about how are those stories operating in those spaces, because we read them every time we decide how we're going to engage. Ms. Smith read a story about Dewan in her mind and then chose to act. And that story is simplistic. That story was not complex. And so there's this quote from Chimamanda Adichie. She says, stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories have been used to empower and to humanize. And if you get a chance to watch her TED Talk, single story, it's another way of kind of thinking about the stories that we have. And so that is how I like to think about implicit and explicit biases, stories that we have for different groups of people, sides of town, cultures that we read from to make certain choices. And those stories can be very short, they can be very long, but the thing about stories is that we have the power to edit them. And so these stories are consistent of attitudes, stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions. These feelings are based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, accent, region, religion, appearance, a host of other things. There's also a difference between explicit and implicit bias. So explicit means you're very aware that you have this bias. I have an explicit bias for Jenny's ice cream. And, you know, if you don't love Jenny's ice cream, then I think there's something wrong with your decision-making skills. That's just how I feel, right? But there's other kinds of explicit biases. You also have implicit biases, not necessarily knowing that you have this particular bias, right? It's subconscious, not what we're thinking about. And so we also can be thinking about how biases aren't necessarily bad, right? So they can be positive or negative. Like I said, you have this bias towards chocolate ice cream. Nothing wrong with that, right? Or Jenny's ice cream or whatever it might be. The problem with biases is when they get connected to power, which we'll talk about. But thinking about, so it's not a big deal if I love Jenny's ice cream, right? And I just share with the world. But if I have the power to make everybody eat Jenny's ice cream no matter what, then we start seeing how biases mixed with power can create oppression. So implicit bias is involuntary and unintentional favorable or unfavorable assessments. So keeping in mind how these are stories that we read from. And what's really important is that we develop these biases over time through exposure of direct and indirect messages. Bias are the stories we internalize that we create or are created for us. So I want you to be thinking about what stories do you have that could use some editing. And usually the stories that require editing are stories that are shaped by, that include people who do not have our privileges, right? So as a US citizen, I have a particular set of privileges that are around that. So I can choose not to have a long story around what's the difference between being a refugee and an immigrant. What's the difference between having a green card and a visa? I don't particularly have to know those things. Those are stories around an identity that I don't have. And my privilege can keep me from having a better understanding of that. So if you think about wherever your privileges lie, there's a good chance whoever does not have that privilege is a short story that you can edit. Normal. So these are when certain identities dominate social norms, societal values, laws, policies, and those who don't identify with these identities can be marginalized socially, institutionally, or systemically. So when we think of quote unquote normal, big air quotes, normal, we can think about like, what are those identities in the United States? Now, given how societal norms work, those can shift from space to space. So concepts of normal in the United States are not going to be the same in, let's say, China or some other space. So in the United States, we have 8 relatively consistent concepts of quote unquote normal. When I say normal, it's that these identities, people with most of these, the more of these identities you have, the more likely your story and your experience is going to be centered. So of these identities, we have white, male, middle class, heterosexual, Christian, English speaking, able-bodied, and citizen. So if we think about, let's say I have a friend, you know, and he's a white guy, and he lives in the suburbs, and we go running together, and me and his wife and his kids and all of us, we go to church together, and you know, he's from Dublin, you know, you're like, oh, he seems really cool guy, you know, whatever. But if I said that I had a friend that was a Korean who identifies as a lesbian, who is currently in poverty, who is Buddhist and doesn't speak English and is wheelchair bound, you're just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. A wheelchair bound Korean lesbian that's Buddhist? What is that? Is it weird? Or is it just another set of identities? So when we think about normal, we think about these 8 identities tend to sit in the middle, in the center. And the fewer of those you have, you get pushed to the side. So when people say marginalized, you can think literally like that. Think of like a piece of paper in front of you, write a circle in the middle, and as you get pushed out away from that center, you get pushed literally to the margins, like the margins of that paper. So this Korean friend has so few of these normalizing identities that somehow in our mind she's rendered as weird or odd or different, when really she just has another set of identities. So there's nothing wrong with these particular 8. The problem is when we center them to a degree where we erase others. So if you think about if there was a, just think about who has fewer of these identities and how we start to conceptualize them. Do we see them as just another set of identities, like the middle class, like Christian friend in Dublin, like who goes running? Does that still feel very normal? Like how does someone who has none of these identities, do we still see them as quote unquote normal, or someone who's included, right? And so we want to be asking ourselves those kinds of questions. So then think, is normalcy centered in your curriculum? Pushing yourself, looking at these 8 identities, when you pick stories, does the main characters, the protagonists, have most of those identities? Few of those of 8 identities? How are we decentering this particular set of identities? Again, nothing wrong with those kind of normalizing identities. The problem is that we continue to center them. When choosing content, do you ask yourself who is often present when we're thinking about history, when we're thinking about, when we're highlighting sciences or certain methods of solving problems or considering things, and who isn't, who is absent here? And usually when we use those 8 normalizing factors and we say, okay, I'm going to pick something with somebody who only has 2 of these identities, and they can't have anything else. Like really push yourself to start seeking out those other types of stories. Race. So race is one of the most challenged, if you will, concepts that many people aren't particularly aware of. So race is this superficial and really misleading classification of human beings created by Europeans during the Enlightenment period, 17th through 19th century, which assigns human worth and social status using white as a model of humanity and the height of human achievement for the purpose of establishing and maintaining privilege and power. This concept served as a foundation for and justification of the transatlantic slave trade and global colonization. So this is really important because we know who created race. Like, we know who they are. We got their names, we got their email addresses, we know their phone numbers. We know, right? So prior to the 17th century, people were not conceptualizing themselves through race. They were thinking about social linguistic groups. People were like, I'm specifically from this Germanic tribe, right? So which we now call Germany. I'm specifically Yoruba or Ewe. I'm specifically of this particular ethnic group. And then you have some folks who were particularly out of Europe, were really just identifying folks based on like religion. Either you're a Catholic or you're a pagan or something like that. But race was not a centering concept. And so I want us to think a little bit about how we got here, right? Because it was created, and even though we call it a social construct, it was completely made up, really just to justify oppression. That's the only reason race was created, to really shape whiteness in certain kinds of ways, in order to justify certain types of domination. There was no other reason to create it, right? And so the same way it was created, we can start thinking about what does it mean to dismantle its power, not necessarily to get rid of the term race, because the problem isn't race identification in and of itself, it's what we're doing with it, right? And so I'm going to go very quickly through about maybe about 400 years of information, but really quickly, so we can start thinking about kind of how power and stories start to shape how we understand the world around us. So in the 1440s, there was a series of Catholic papal bulls. So that means these are basically directives that come out of that come from the Pope directly. And there were three that we call the doctrine of discovery. Now, these words I think are in Latin. I don't know how to say these things. So if y'all know how to speak Latin, feel free to put it in the chat phonetically. But otherwise, you see them, they're highlighted in yellow. But they're called doctrine of discovery. And so it became a way for popes, particularly those popes within the Catholic Church, to really be in cahoots with other imperial powers to justify the taking of indigenous lands, taking of enslaving of indigenous and African people to justify slavery. What it did was gave Christian explorers the right to lay claim to any land that was not inhabited by Christians, and they could be discovered. So that's also some challenges around the word discovered, because how do you discover a place where people already live? So if the inhabitants are converted, their lives could potentially be spared, according to these papal bulls. But if they chose not to convert, they could be either enslaved or killed. So with the first one, or with the other in 1453, this is Pope Nicholas V that specifically authorized Alfonso V to reduce any Saracens, which was a pejorative term for Muslims, and any pagans and unbelievers into perpetual slavery, which is drastically different when we think about chattel slavery, because prior to that, people often say, well, slavery was everywhere. That's true, but usually it was connected to a debt, right? So if you owe somebody money, you were in debt to them, you had to work for them for X amount of years, and then you're done. But what happened here from the papal bulls was this new kind of slavery called chattel slavery, which means you didn't have to do anything, but you are enslaved for the rest of your life, and your children will be enslaved. And they didn't do anything. So that is what was new. That was specific about the United States, the Caribbean, and South America, this idea of perpetual slavery. And so the Portuguese is who started the transatlantic slave trade, going directly to Brazil. So the largest amount of Africans went to Brazil. The second amount were taken to the Caribbean, and really the smallest amount actually of Africans were brought to the United States. So when you think of millions of Africans were brought to the United States, or ended up here in the United States, and we can think about how large the space is. So when we think about a kind of quick way of thinking about what European countries were kind of allowed to expand outside of their country, just think about who's speaking what language. Spanish is a European language, so essentially Mexico and Cuba and Puerto Rico, they speak Spanish because the Spanish country had explorers that came there and then colonized and enslaved the folks there. And that's the only reason why Brazil speaks Portuguese. Portugal is a European country, right? So thinking about those things. So 1455, we had this other papal bull that really speaks to, not only can you take the land, you can take the land, you can take everything that's in it, and take the people and see them, and they're seen as kind of enemies of Christ. So in 1493, you have Pope Alexander VI that's essentially saying, okay, we have now all these quote unquote Christian nations of in Europe are now just laying claim to all these land, but you can't have, one Christian nation like fighting with another one. So when one place claims one place, like you can't come back. So if France claims one side of Hispaniola, right, which we'll call Haiti, and then Spain claims this other side, which we call Dominican Republic, right? Y'all can't fight over these lands. Once somebody's already claimed it, it's theirs. So he kind of, so that's what that papal bull does. Again, this justification of slave trade and taking of lands. But this one specifically highlighted Christopher Columbus and the right to plunder. It was financed by Isabella and Ferdinand. They helped to finance this exploration, if you will, but specifically really couched him as a missionary of sorts, like he was there to convert people. But we really know the hidden way was this wasn't really that hidden, because they talk about you can take their dwellings and things like that, but it's under the guise of spreading Catholicism. But again, this is really important to recognize how it was this kind of facade to better understand how we were thinking about power. So when I want to say what's really important, the doctrine of discovery and sharing how this began, how we start to conceptualize race, is not an indictment of the Catholic Church or Christianity as a whole. That's really important to recognize. What I really want us to understand is how there was a choice of certain popes at certain time abusing their power, and how it has such a significant impact with those handful of folks in this particular institution really ultimately shaped how we're starting to think about the world around us. So fast forward, you have Carl Linnaeus, who's a Swedish botanist, and he is seen as the father of taxonomy. So he has been creating these lists of like species and helping us think through these things. But he ultimately then coded race as a species. And we found out that you can't really do that, right? Of course, later we found out you can't really do that, but he was the person that basically said people of different races are genetically different. And so you had a host of different theories that came out of that. One was called environmentalism. So that's not the way we're thinking about it now. But essentially it was a belief that if you were, you could take on other people's characteristics and values based on their proximity to you. So you have a variety of different kinds of abolitionists at the time, but there were different abolitionists didn't necessarily all see Africans as full human beings. So you had some abolitionists that were like, Black Africans are full human beings, they should not be enslaved, we need to end slavery. Well, there were some abolitionists that were also environmentalists, and they were saying, well, we need to end slavery because slavery requires Africans to be too close to white people. And because they're in such close proximity, white people can then take on these barbaric characteristics of these less than human Africans. So they consider themselves abolitionists, but very different perspectives. So when we think about environmentalism, we can still see how that same concept shows up in things like redlining and the ways in which segregation still remains today. So fast forward, we have this Human Genome Project that happens with a collaboration of thousands of scientists around the world that's trying to better understand how genomes work and how we're understanding human beings. Well, what they determined was, before we had this incorrect biological view that everybody is of these separate races and there's to some degree, some different genetic differences with everyone. But then from their research, they realized that this is really incorrect. So what they found was actually there's more diversity within races than between them. So I'm more likely to have more genetic similarities to, I don't know, Leonardo DiCaprio than Denzel Washington, right? So within races, there's more genetic diversity. So really being able to categorize people by race genetically is what they found is impossible. So some questions to think about: what are some concepts education might be pushing that it shouldn't? Because essentially this idea of race and these, what we call now pseudoscientific ways of thinking, came out of the academy and out of education. What are some concepts that should be pushed more? How can this information help us understand the connection we have between, or the connection between power and impact? So we're thinking about people in powerful positions, whether they're seen as scientists, academics, or the Pope, and how the power that they have with the stories that they held, and how that ultimately impact a large range of people outside of those who actually created it, right? So when we think about power, it's a relational term that describes an individual or group's agency to control resources, decision-making, definitions of reality, and their capacity to act. It's really a relational term. So we use words like I'm empowered, and that has a lot to do with how you're thinking about yourself, like individually. But power in and of itself requires a connection to another human being or another thing. It's something that you do on something or on someone. So really thinking about how power requires something else. So it's really important to think about how power is being used for certain gains. Prejudice is a prejudgment in favor or against a person, a group, an event, an idea, or an object. An action based on prejudgment is discrimination. A negative prejudgment is often called a stereotype. An action based on a stereotype is called bigotry. What distinguishes this group of terms from remaining terms is that there's no power relationship necessarily implied or expressed in these terms. So when we think about prejudice, it depends on what is your degree of power when you make this action, when you take this particular action. What is the degree of impact, right? So we can't just say that these particular scientists were just prejudiced, right? It goes beyond that because of the power in which they had to spread these particular ideas. So privilege is an unearned advantage, rights, resources, opportunities, protections, etc., often to an individual group based on their social identity or circumstances. So it reminds me of a time when I was talking with a colleague, and we were at a coffee shop, and she was doing this work. She was teaching this class around identity, race, and particularly when it got to race, helping people have a better understanding of what white supremacy is. Now, what she was trying to convey was white supremacy is not about us, not so much about the very far, like, extremists, right? Thinking about KKK, Aryan Nation, not so much that, but thinking about white supremacy as whose stories get centered. Go back to that list of like, quote unquote, normalcy, like whose stories get centered when policy is created, when history is told, when narratives are shaped, like how whiteness can get centered in certain kinds of ways. And she was teaching a class of mostly almost all white students, and they just weren't understanding. They were not kind of grasping it. She was getting really frustrated. And I told her, I said, look outside of this coffee shop. Have you noticed that there are a lot of people, or a lot of construction happening? Sidewalks torn up, there's a whole lot going on in the street. She's like, yeah, I noticed. I said, did you also recognize that it's very difficult to come into this space if you were in a wheelchair? And she said, no, I actually didn't think about it. I said, you didn't think about it because you're able-bodied. That is a privilege you have. So yeah, you maybe had to step over a couple of rocks or whatever, but essentially it didn't really take much for you to get in here. Our privileges oftentimes blind us to the ways in which other people who don't have our privileges are engaging in the world. So the same way you weren't thinking about what does it mean to be someone who's differently abled and trying to access spaces, and you weren't really thinking about it till someone brought it up to you, it's similar to what's happening to your students. Oftentimes, people who identify as white aren't thinking about how their whiteness shapes their lives. We don't, as a society, we really aren't asking them to do that. With most of the normalizing identities, we're not asked to think about, have you thought about what does it mean to be an English speaker only? Have you thought about what it means to be a citizen and how that shows up in the world? You probably aren't thinking about it because they're privileged identities. And so we all have some degree of privilege. All of us have something. Now, these other kinds of identities may limit the degree of privilege we have with those privileged identities, but nonetheless, we have them. And so we want to be thinking about how that can impact not only how we're engaging with the world, but really help us allow, to a degree of grace, of folks who may not be thinking about how they're showing up in the world because no one has pointed out the way that their privileged identities are shaping their experiences. If you remember the challenges a few years ago around the pipelines, I saw this tweet and I thought it to be very interesting and telling, thinking about privilege. And so she writes, privilege is saving Confederacy statues because they're historic, but bulldozing through ancient sacred sites and artifacts for pipelines. So thinking again about whose stories get centered based on our action and who's seen as unimportant, disposable in certain kinds of ways, and how privilege can guide that. And thinking about not only just privilege, again, connecting it to power, always connecting it to power and other identities, and how your identities will shape degree to which power impacts you. So here's a concept that may be new, this idea of anti-Blackness. And so I quote heavily from a particular professor who's thinking about this, and that's Dr. Ross. So she says, anti-Blackness describes an inability to recognize Black humanity. It captures the reality that the kind of violence that saturates Black life is not based on any specific thing a Black person did. It is complicated by America's need for Black people's existence to measure non-Black people's humanness against. Anti-Blackness identifies Blackness as inextricably tied to slaveness in American society. This tie disconnects humanity from Blackness because America made Black people into things or property. Dr. Ross says the thingification, she calls, of Black people is a fundamental concept of identity of this nation. Scholars who study anti-Blackness argue that racism is a catch-all term that encapsulates anything from Black people being denied for access to mortgage loans to Asian students being burdened with model minority label. It's not specific. So to just say this is a result of racism doesn't necessarily help us understand how racism impacts Black people in particular kinds of ways. And so calling it anti-Blackness helps us understand how systems and institutions, policies and procedures tend to be shaped a bit differently when they're targeting Black communities. So when we think of racism, we can think of it as race prejudice plus power. So you have a thought or action that is against another human being based on race, but when you connect that to the power to enact certain systems, to engage certain policies, to really shape people's experiences, we can think of those two together. So some ways that we can be thinking about racism, one, this idea of interpersonal, which we oftentimes focus on, is how we're talking to each other, who called who a name, etc. But usually it's pretty limiting, right? Yes, it's important for us to be caring for and talking to each other with kindness and respect. But if we limit our understanding of racism to that, we're missing a bigger picture. So this other level of racism is institutional racism. And so that is the ways in which people have disproportionate access to different systems. So that can be education, finance, housing, healthcare, law enforcement, employment, criminal justice, etc. A host of different things. So really thinking about how are people's identity, particularly in this case, race, shaping how you have access to housing or education, or how you're engaging with law enforcement. So thinking about institutions. So then when we take it a step further and think about systemic, when you hear people say systemic racism, they're saying how these institutions may be working together, either covertly or overtly, to cause larger concepts of oppression, right? And really thinking about how might, let's say, financing industry, Black people having less access to home loans, and if they get a home loan, more likely to be charged more, how does that shape the kind of houses they can afford? And then that shapes what kind of neighborhood that they're in, which will shape the kind of education that their children will receive, which can, and that neighborhood could also impact whether or not they have adequate healthcare or there's food deserts. It's a host of other things. So maybe it's not so much that this bank is in cahoots with the education system, right? But we can still see how these systems end up having this compacted experience for people. And all of these things are really shaped by theories. So this idea, right, around race is a theory, right? Gender, arguably, is a theory, right? It's a way in which we're trying to understand the way people are existing in the world. So we want to be thinking about it's really important. These theories are shaping our stories, and those stories are shaping our actions. So if we can start to pick apart our stories, we can start to pick apart the theories that are feeding it, which we can then start to think about how is that shaping our policies, our procedures, the way in which systems are engaging and institutions are engaging with groups of people. So all of these things are moving around. So when we're thinking about systemic racism, it can feel very different and far away from us. But these systems don't necessarily exist completely on their own. They're created and sustained by human beings. So these individuals who have these stories that can negatively impact different people, they're the ones who are maintaining some of these systems. They are the people who are doing the hiring, the folks who are the underwriter at that mortgage company, the police officer in that precinct, so that judge sitting on that stand. So these are still individuals who are ultimately shaping institutions and systems. So we have to see them as interconnected and not separate from each other. So when we think of, some people use systemic and structural interchangeably, but essentially we're saying the same things, a system of advantage based on race. And it encompasses the entire system of white supremacy. Again, think about white supremacy as centering certain identities when we think about who has access to systems disproportionately over others. And that includes how we're thinking about history, culture, politics, economics, our social interactions, and really thinking about structural or systemic racism as the most profound and pervasive form of racism. And so when we only limit racism to how we're talking to each other, that interpersonal, it's such a small piece of this larger understanding of how people are existing in the world. And so we have to be digging a bit deeper into how systems and institutions are functioning. So here's a couple examples. Jennifer Eberhardt is a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, and she came out with a book last year called Bias. And she's a social psychologist, and her work focuses a lot on how we're thinking about different groups of people. But this particular research was looked at how we have perceptions of Black men in particular. And what she found over and over in her research is that Black people, but particularly Black men, are often seen as not human, often associated with animals. When people think of crime, they automatically think of Black people, even if the race of the person is not discussed. When people, and vice versa, when people think about Black people, they often are thinking about crime. What I saw that was very interesting in her research as well was the way in which people were punished, or the degree of sentencing based on their physical features. So what she found was that if you had two Black people who committed the same crime, if they have more Afrocentric features, so maybe or the Blackness, if you will, of their features. If they had darker skin, more tightly curled hair, larger noses, larger lips, they tend to have longer sentences than another Black person who committed the same crime, who was more fair-skinned, maybe more Eurocentric features. They would tend to have a shorter sentence. So when we're thinking about the ways we have a history of associating people's connection to whiteness, right? So the more fairer person, the person with more Eurocentric features are seen as closer to whiteness, right? How whiteness is seen as something that deserves less punishment, right? Where the more, the Blacker you are, if you will, you are seen as more punishable. So thinking about, again, this idea of anti-Blackness and how that can show up in systems and decisions that are made. Redlining is another way of thinking about systemic racism. So this was a practice that was done in the, around the I want to say started in the mid-1930s. Don't quote me on that, but I feel that that's right. And this is a map of Columbus. And so there were different ways in which realtors labeled color-coded communities. So this happened all across the country. And this helped to determine who would get federally backed home loans to what degree. So if you were in a green area, you would get you could get an 80% home loan, right? So I don't know how many people out there own a home, But if you got a home, you likely paid like 20% down. So that's essentially what people who were in green colored areas were able to get. Now, these were people who were identified as white. So these folks were able to get those kinds of homes. We jumped down to yellow. These were areas that were generally for what we would call ethnic whites, right? So they had to come up with about 85% down, so they could get a 15%, a home loan off of 15%. And so that's generally how we understand things like how spaces like Hungarian village or Italian village or German village, like these were places where if you were one of those quote unquote ethnic whites, that you could live in those spaces, and also other kinds of immigrants. But if you're in a red area, like your King Lincoln, your South Linden, you couldn't get any federally backed home loan. So when we start thinking about how neighborhoods are constructed, how that continues to show up today, how that shapes how the city invests in certain areas or not, how that shapes schools, we can start thinking about how something that stopped years later is now illegal, but how that still has different effects. So things like in these red line areas, you tend to have local governments will allow factory zoning in these spaces. So thinking about how those factories are still there, how those factories are still allowed to pollute, right? All factories are allowed to pollute. You can only pollute to a certain degree. But these factories are not in Upper Arlington or Bexley, right? So when we start looking at zip codes and that there's a 10+ year difference of life expectancy for someone in South Linden versus someone in Upper Arlington, we can start to think about how systemic or structural racism is still impacting people's life expectancy. So this quote from Martin Luther King says, "I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate who paternalistically believes that he can set a timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season." And I love this quote because one, it helps us think about Martin Luther King in a way that we don't always think about him, but he's essentially highlighting what we would call now liberals, right? So he's saying the white moderate who is saying they're in line with him, right? But they're still telling him that what you're asking for too much, King. You're asking, you don't need all that, right? So really thinking about what's the story that we have, as much as we call ourselves like allies, like are we really still trying to utilize certain degrees of power to tell people what they should get or what they shouldn't get? And are we using that power to really be thinking about how systems are impacting people? So a couple of things to remember when we're thinking about racism: it's not about you being a bad person or individual people. It's about systems that make it easy to treat certain people poorly. Racism isn't saying that there aren't disadvantaged white people. So oftentimes when I do workshops, there's someone who says, well, I understand racism because although I'm white, I grew up poor. Those are different things, right? When we're thinking about class and race, those are not necessarily the same things. It's saying that they aren't disadvantaged because they're white. So if they were in poverty, we could likely point to something else, deindustrialization, a host of other things, but they're likely not in poverty because of their whiteness. When we have studies around wealth gaps, oftentimes connected to access to housing, or the ways in which places like Wells Fargo charges higher interest rates for students who are going to HBCUs, we can point out the ways in which different systems and institutions are charging more to people of color, so they actually are paying more for similar services. So we can actually connect that wealth gap directly to race. So talking about racism is not racist. So just like talking about gender isn't sexist. We have a lot of people in our lives who are of different genders. For example, we may have women in our lives, we have wives, mothers, sisters, etc. But if they wanted to share with us the ways in which they're experiencing the world as women and want us to understand that doesn't mean, oh, we don't want to talk about like gender, like that's sexist to talk about you being a woman. It sounds silly, right? How is that sexist, me talking about being a woman? That doesn't make any sense, right? The issue is not me being a woman. The issue is around how I'm being treated as a woman. In the same way with race. Race is not the problem. Racism is a problem. So instead, we can talk about the ways in which identity helps us to understand the different ways systems are impacting people, and we can take the opportunity to learn more. So a question to ask yourself is think about how can understanding racism help you understand how students and families are experiencing school in their communities? How can that help us better understand what people are bringing into our classrooms, whether it be parents, guardians, or students themselves? So ethnicity is another definition we can be thinking about. An ethnic group, or ethnicity is a category of people who identify with each other, grounded in presumed similarities such as language, ancestry, history, society, culture, nation, a host of other things. Sometimes it can overlap with nationality. So I'll give you an example of my brother. So this is my little brother. He is going to get married in March. I don't know with COVID, we'll see how this works out, but he's supposed to get married. He's getting married to Celine. So, of course, my brother is from the United States. Celine is from Trinidad and Tobago. So that's where her family's from. That's how I identify as Trinidadian. Now, if you don't know much about Trinidad, like this was another space where there's a lot of African Black history that is there, and some of that Black cultural expression is through this experience called Carnival, and that happens across the Caribbean. You can also go to Caribana in Toronto, so it's this celebration which is definitely grounded in African culture. So this is a space that she identifies. Now, when you look at Celine's family, her dad is Portuguese. So technically from, identifies with a European country. And if you don't know what Portugal is, it's right next to Spain. Her mother is Indian. So of course from India, an Asian space in near China. So the way we construct identity in the United States, particularly race, you are required, it's an unspoken requirement that you're supposed to choose your minoritized identity. So for example, Barack Obama is just as much white as he is Black, but it's socially unacceptable for him to identify as white. Like he's not quote unquote allowed to, right? Although he's equal parts of both. So you're supposed to pick your minoritized identity. So if Celine had to do that, then essentially, she would have to pick Asian based on the way we construct race. And so essentially race is very limiting, right? So for example, there's no solid racial category for people who we would call as Middle Easterners, right? Technically on the census, they could check white or Asian, right? And similar to folks who may identify as Latinx or Hispanic, they can check white, Black, some other races. So really, when we're thinking about identities, particularly ethnicity, it really gives people a bit more space and room to kind of identify themselves, because race can be very limiting in certain kinds of ways. So another ethnicity we can be thinking about is Latino versus kind of Hispanic. So a way we can be thinking about that is Latino or Latina or Latinx, which we'll get to, is really thinking about people who identify with a space in Latin America. And they may or may not speak Spanish. So Latino includes Brazil, but does not include Spain, because Spain is not considered in Latin America. So Latin America would be your Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, like Honduras, right? Hispanic is connected to a Spanish-speaking country. So that includes Spain, but does not include Brazil, because Brazil does not speak Spanish. Although it is in Latin America, they will be considered Latino, but they don't speak Spanish. So we can think of it like this. Juju, who's a singer out of Cuba, she is dark-skinned. She may consider herself Black, but she is a Latina. Zoe Saldana, she's Dominican. She may consider herself Black. She's still Latina. Jennifer Lopez, Puerto Rican, Latina. Giselle Bundchen, I think I'm saying her name right. She's Brazilian, doesn't speak Spanish, but it's technically would be a Latina, right? So we can see the ways in which race can show up in a lot of different ways when we're thinking about ethnicity. And so when we're thinking about different people's identities, considering how they may be existing differently based on how their race and how they're showing up in different ways. One way we can be thinking about this is, I don't know if you heard of Goya Gate, where you have the CEO of Goya Foods, which is a food company that heavily focuses on Latin American foods. He praised Trump. And so Julian Castro said, like, how dare you? You shouldn't be praising Trump. He's done so many terrible things to Latin American immigrants and all these different things. But then that was like a Twitter, thread. And then people began to say, well, wait a minute, how does Bob, the CEO, identify? Well, he identifies as Hispanic, but particularly he identifies with his ancestry to Spain. So when you think about, again, going back to who colonized whom, right? So if you think about Mexicans, Honduras, people from Honduras are really native people who are forced to speak Spanish. We can think about how their identity is essentially connected to their space is connected to an imperial power like Spain, forcing themselves on these spaces, right? And so if he identifies, so some folks were like, well, he identifies with the colonizer. He identifies with the folks who actually created the oppression. So he's not gonna have this care or this appreciation for folks who identify themselves as Latino or Latina and this particular type of identity around these colonized spaces. So it's like, oh, we're mixing his identity with another group of people, which could be inaccurate. So this is a way of thinking about actually asking folks or understanding how people can identify a bit differently. Latinx is something that you may have heard. And it's really a gender neutral way of people to describe a Latin American heritage. So if you've ever taken Spanish, you know that the O in Latino is a masculine term, right? And you can see, if you take in Spanish, there's a feminine and a masculine way of talking about things. And the A is a more feminine, is understood as feminine. So starting in the 90s, people start to feel like you're continuing with this limiting ways of thinking about gender. So then they replace the A and the O with an X as really like this linguistic protest, if you will, around how language, particularly language from European spaces like Spanish, can be limiting in ways that doesn't allow for a full expression of gender identities. So this is along with the same history of womanism, really rethinking, inserting Black women's history into feminism and spelling it a different way. Womenex, like another way of spelling language as a way of this kind of linguistic protest. So not everybody who identifies as Latino or Latina adheres to this concept, really because it has less to do with race as much as is more to do with gender. So if people aren't necessarily thinking about gender, they may not necessarily align themselves with this term, or maybe just not want to do it, right? What's really important about Latino, Latinx, Latina, Hispanic, they're very much used in the United States. So if you go somewhere else, you go to Argentina, it's like, well, how do you identify? Do you identify as Hispanic or Latina or Latina? Or they might be like, what? What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. So it's very much something that is contextualized in the United States. So you might find people who don't identify this at all because it's specific to our culture. So something to be thinking about, are you making room for students to express their identities beyond race? So another definition is thinking about intersectionality. So this is a way for people to discuss social justice systems that oppress people based on certain identities, like multiple identities at once. And so recognizing that everybody doesn't have just one identity, you're multiple identities at the same time. So this came from Dr. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who was doing a lot of work around understanding how race, power, and the law come together. But she was looking at this one particular lawsuit where these Black women were suing an automobile company for employment discrimination. And they were saying they weren't being hired because they're both Black and female. So this intersection of gender and race together. And so when they went to court, the company said, well, we're not sexist because we hire women, but they were only hiring women in administration. And they said, well, we're also not racist because we hire Black people, but they were only hiring Black men in the factory. So then the question was, where do Black women get hired? Because they have both of these identities, it ultimately kept them from both of these occupations. So there wasn't any language in the law to really talk about how multiple identities can come together to impact how you have access to systems. And so you can literally think of it as an intersection, like at a street where these identities are coming together to create certain forms of oppression. Many of us maybe had an experience or heard of Susan B. Anthony, known as his 19th century suffragist, focused on helping women get the right to vote. Well, she also, her and her crew also said this, I will cut off this right arm of mine before I ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman. So there's a particular conundrum in that. So she's not interested in helping Black people get the vote, but she wants women to vote. So where does that leave Black women? So when we talk about women had access to vote, they were really fighting for white women to be able to vote. All Black people weren't able to vote until like 100 years or so later, right? When we talk about civil rights movement. So thinking about these intersections of multiple identities coming together and how that impacts you to have access. We can think about the gender wage gap, which many of you maybe have heard. Oftentimes the statistic says women make about 75 cents to every man's dollar, but when we actually look at that data intersectionally, it's really, they're comparing white women make about 75 cents to every white man's dollar. Black women only make about 60 cents. Hispanic women make about 55. Native women, who's not on this, make about 45 cents to every man's dollar. So when we think about how to address the gender wage gap, and we say, oh, we just need to give everybody a quarter, right? All women just need a quarter to make it equal. It's like, well, no, white women maybe need about a quarter, Black women need about 40 cents, Native women need about 55 cents, Hispanic women need about 45 cents. So when we think about equity, we're saying giving people what they need where they are. So when we start looking at data information intersectionally, we can ask better questions. Similar with in schools, detention and suspension rates. So oftentimes we hear that Black children are 3 times more likely to be suspended or detained or given detention more than white students who've done the same infractions. But when we look at that data intersectionally, we see that Black girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended or given detention for doing the same infractions as their white female counterparts. So if we don't really look at data intersectionally, we don't get the full picture, have a better understanding what's happening. Again, looking at this intersection. Now, we might use gender and race here, but you can think about other identities as well and how those multiple identities create different kinds of oppression. So intersections help us understand how structural systems of oppression can work. So when we add different identities, we ask better questions, we can get a better understanding of what's happening. So microaggressions are verbal behavior and environmental indignities that people can feel that might seem slight, but are really, they can accumulate over time. You can think of them as kind of death as from a thousand cuts. Like all these minor things happening over and over again. And so when we think about microaggressions, we can think about them as cumulative, they're historical in context, and really who's saying it to whom is really key. What's the hidden implication? So I'm gonna go through just a few examples. I'm gonna help us understand something like "you are so articulate." So it really, what it is saying, here's a quote: when a white colleague tells a colleague of color, "You're so articulate," or "You speak so well," it suggests that you were expecting less, right? So kind of like if I brought NASA to come and talk to you about space, and you go to this lecture, and then after it's done, you go to them and say, "Oh my gosh, you guys, you know so much about space," and they're looking at you like, we're astronauts. That's kind of what we do, right? So by saying that, you're implying that you expected them to maybe not know. So when you say that someone's so articulate, you're implying that you thought that they wouldn't be. So instead, we can just commend people on specific ideas and insights, but not really on how they're speaking, unless that's specific feedback that they're asking for. This idea of where you're actually from, not to be confused with where you're from. So when folks who maybe aren't within this black-white binary, maybe Latinx folks or Asian folks, are asked this question, it implies that that the person of color is inconsistent with being American. So if you have somebody with a heavy accent from some place that you are not thinking is America, and you ask them where they're from, and they say Pittsburgh, and you're like, no, where are you actually from? That's the problem, right? So they have this heavy accent and they say Pittsburgh, you say cool. And then you talk about the Steelers or whatever is happening in Pittsburgh. Like when you keep pushing this idea of that their answer is incorrect, you're implying that they're supposed to answer a space that's outside the United States. So who they are is not consistent with being American. And so you want to make sure that we're not doing that. So instead you say nothing. And if the person wants to discuss their identity and bring it up, they can do that. And then really ask yourself, why am I asking this? And do I ask everybody that? Where are they actually from? When someone who kind of appears, quote unquote, American, you say, no. Are your ancestors from Ireland? I want to know. Tell me. Like, are you from there? Like, no, we don't really do that. So ask yourself, why are you doing that in the first place? This idea of I don't see color. And really looking at how when we say that we're denying people's racial existence, and we want to make sure that we aren't doing that. And knowing that when we say we don't see color, we're also saying that we can't be allies against racial oppression, because we're saying we don't see race. So that means we can't see racist systems. So we can't fight against the things that we're choosing not to see. So instead, we can say nothing and recognize that people are experiencing the world a bit differently than we are, and recognize that in this way of erasure that we can be complicit in their harm. So some microaggressions that can happen in the classroom: failing to pronounce students' names, and especially after students have corrected you, and creating a nickname for them when they haven't given that to you, basically to recognize that you have your own incapabilities, right? So you have to work on saying their names correctly. Some other microaggressions: avoiding calling a parent because you know English is not their first language and you don't want to have challenges talking with them. Scheduling tests or project dates around religious or cultural holidays. Having low expectations for students from particular feeder patterns or neighborhoods or social groups. Assigning students tasks that reinforce different gender roles, and don't allow students to be flexible on how they're engaging in the classroom. Anticipating students' emotional responses based on their gender orientation or a sexual orientation or race or ethnicity. And using terms like illegals to reference undocumented students, a situation that they have no control over. So really thinking about how are you shifting people's experience. Expecting students of particular groups to represent their whole social group or racial group. Having students engage in required reading where the protagonists are always white. Dead naming students, so students who have given you their proper pronouns or are in the middle of a transition and want to change their name, and respecting that. Assigning projects that ignores students of different socioeconomic status. So if you have a project where the expectation is students, or you get an A if you spent all this money on this project, can a student who only had $5 or no money also get an A? So think about how you're setting up your rubric and expectations, and assuming that students of particular ethnicity speak another language or speak a certain language and may not speak English, that's assumptions, right? We want to be clear that we're not doing that. And asking people with hidden disabilities to identify themselves in class. We want to make sure we're not having students kind of open themselves in that kind of way. So you want to ask yourself, what are some microaggressions you might be experiencing or your students might be experiencing in this space? So on our last minute, I'll do our last definition. And I want to, this is a popular, cartoon helping us understand the difference between equity, equality, and liberation, really thinking about a fence as the barrier to access. So in this case, access to the baseball field. And equity, really looking at giving people what they need, where they are, and liberation meaning removing the system completely. So one way of thinking about this is called target universalism. And this is a way of really creating strategies around shared goals so that people can get what they need based on where they are. And how that is going to look different based on how systems are impacting them. So if you think of it as, let's say you're all at a watching this in-person presentation, and everyone's across the room and they have different access to be able to see. Now, some people are having different challenges being able to see based on where they're positioned in the room. Well, you have this very nice couple who said, hey, we have some extra glasses and we want to, share that with you guys so you guys can use these glasses so you can see better. Well, as you can imagine, giving their glasses to some people who didn't have them, it worked very well for some folks. They're like, oh, this is really great. This is really helpful. I can see better. Or for some folks, it's like, well, I didn't really need glasses. I needed to move. I need to move closer. Some of them was like, these glasses don't work. Actually, it's making it worse. It's very frustrating. It's straining my eyes. So we can start to think as targeted universalism, as equity 2.0, is really like, we can't just it's no one size fits all, right? Everybody's gonna need something different based on who they are, where they are positioned. And so we wanna be thinking about equality is giving everybody the same thing. That doesn't necessarily work. And everybody needs a different prescription, right? So we all need a different way to reach the shared goal of seeing this presentation and get this information. And people are gonna need something different. Giving groups what they need to reach their goal, and that's going to look a little different for each group, for each person, or each social group, or racial group, or gender group, or multiple. And the goal is not determined by the privileged group. So oftentimes we center whiteness even in our data. So when we say for students, students of this particular minoritized group are not at the same level as white students. Well, in some areas, even white students aren't doing that great. So should that be the goal? Like, should we be trying to aspire to like the data centered on whiteness, or should we say actually we need to raise the bar for everybody? So really thinking about who is getting centered in our goals, and is that the right way to go? So targeted universalism is focused on systemic change, and really thinking about equity as the goal of liberation. So are you giving your students what they need where they are? And that's important to be thinking about. So real quick, if you go to my website, Mosaic Education Network, we have a host of resources, as well as we have a book club every month. So these are some of the books that are coming up. You can go there to learn more. Also, some work that we're doing around sharing information. We have TEDx King Lincoln Bronzeville as a drive-in. So go to TEDx KLB and you can get your ticket and come join us. But thank you, everybody. Only went 3 minutes over. So I'm open to any questions you may have. If we have some time, I don't know. Y'all tell me if it has to be over, but I can stick around.
No, thank you, Dr. Crum, for taking on this journey, and with so much information, I'm still taking in myself. But no, if you are willing to stay after a few people had some questions. I know we're at time, so if you are somebody who has to leave or jump off, this recording will be available through Kirwan's social media, Facebook and Twitter. So feel free to look for that. But yeah, if I can pull some of the questions that have been coming in. The first one is a question we got from a few people is, can we have these slides and any resources? So other than the video, would you be willing to share your slides, say in a PDF form, or should people go to a place to look for different resources, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, the best place to go for the resources is Mosaic Education Network.com. Also, I can assemble some of the citations that I offered here, and if you want that information, I can definitely get that to you. So you can email me at melissacrum@mosaicieducationnetwork.com, and I can send you those resources for sure.
Great. Well, the next question that we had was regarding detention, pay gaps. Can you talk a little bit about the racist arguments about quote unquote behavior leading to detentions and quote unquote qualifications related to pay gaps and hiring?
Yeah, so when we think about detention and suspensions, there's researchers saying a few things. One, for Black boys, what keeps showing up is that teachers in general either assume that these boys are automatically violent, right? So when we think about the Dewan, who was like, I'm not doing anything, he was very upset. If it was a white child, we may just see him as throwing a tantrum, but not necessarily fearing, right? What we're finding is that teachers, particularly white teachers, tend to be afraid of those Black boys who are expressing themselves in those kinds of ways. So instead of going to him and saying, hey, what's going on, the same way I did and had a conversation with them, it's get out of the classroom, you're being insubordinate, and they're actually in fear. So it goes back to the stories that we're holding for our students and how that shapes our actions. As far as pay gaps, there's a few different things happening there. So one, so there's research around there are folks who will have the same qualifications but still be paid less. So there's some practices that they'll ask when you're about to be hired. They say, what was your previous salary? So since women in general, and then women of color overall, tend to be paid less, when I tell you my previous salary and you maybe only go up so much, I was already underpaid before. So continuing that practice means I will be perpetually underpaid because you're basing it off an already low number. Secondly, there are some women in general who might have fewer qualifications, not because they're incapable, but the way in which certain companies and organizations share those opportunities. So I was working with a company, and there were women who were not being promoted because they would say they were not qualified, or they didn't have the particular skills. But when we dug into that, we realized the way that people were learning about these skills and promotions was through two places. One, the informal social happy hour that happened after work, where VPs and other people you had access to, there's no other time you had access to them, or the company golf tournament, which is where you had access to people in power. So if you're like, hey, I'm interested in elevating, want to know your support, and they were more than willing to give you the access to these opportunities. But if you didn't go to this happy hour, and if you didn't go to this golf tournament, you never found out about these opportunities. So disproportionately, men went to those spaces, or women who didn't mind working after work, or women who didn't have other obligations at home. So we saw that was playing a big role, and why people weren't getting the qualifications. So it's going back to still systems that don't allow transparency, that disproportionately impact women and people of color.
Thank you. That was awesome. Yeah. And the final question that we have here is back to the example of Celine in your talk. was her ethnicity the same as her race or nationality? I think they missed it. And I don't know if you remember.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
That's about to be my sister-in-law.
Yeah, that's right.
So the goal was to understand how race is very limiting. So the way, if she had to identify her race, the way we are kind of required to in the United States, she would have to identify as Asian, because as a biracial person, her father being Portuguese or white and her mom being Indian or Asian, we have to pick our minoritized identity. So I mentioned Barack Obama is just as much white as he is black as a biracial man, but socially it's incorrect for him to identify as white. You don't get to pick whiteness. You have to pick your minoritized identity. So with Celine, labeling herself as Asian is limiting, but her ethnicity as Trinidadian gives so much more space to identify who she is. And it has less emphasis on race as much as it has more to do with culture and that space there. And so for some, nationality and ethnicity overlap, right? So the nation of Trinidad is also becomes this ethnicity, or you can see it as sometimes it overlaps in certain kinds of ways. But race and ethnicity are a bit different, because you can have multiple races within an ethnicity. So that's why I was saying, for example, Zoe Saldana, who is seen as Afro-Latina, who would identify as Black, is a Latina just like Giselle Bundchen, right? Who would identify as white, but she will also be considered a Latina since she's Brazilian.
It's a beautiful way of putting that. I think that those are the questions that we get a lot as well. And, just the way that you describe it, I think is a really great way of even thinking about thinking about it. I think a lot of times it takes a turn academic, and that really makes you think of it as people and people with lived experiences. So I love that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
A couple more questions have come in meanwhile, so people have gotten inspired. So
no problem, I'm here.
The next question is our suggestions for this questioner's participant, who is a Black person, for reconciling the restrictions of working for a system that is historically biased, that is supposed to improve the health of all people. So, what do you do when you're working within these systems that are inherently, racist, and inherently sort of based in white supremacy, that are, nominally working for the benefit of all people as a person of color, whereas a Black person?
Ugh, that is very hard. And there are no easy answers. And so the easiest, that's not the easiest. What I like to ask people is to really dig into recognizing, identifying what is your sphere of influence? Like, what do you have direct change capacity in, right? So for example, there's a lot of research around held beliefs around Black people and pain tolerance. So my mother is a nurse, and she remembers being taught that if Black people can withstand more pain, so you don't have to give them as much pain medication, and white people maybe need more pain medication. They're very like a gentle, sensitive race, right? So in that case, we have current data that talks about, for example, I believe it came out of, was it JAMA? Another medical article that talked about Black and white children in the emergency room. I believe it had to do with getting appendicitis, and how Black children were giving less pain medication for the same surgery, right? And so same thing, there's also research around births, right? So Black women or women of color getting less pain medication during birthing than white women. So what can you do in that moment? You cannot adhere to that, right? If she says that her pain is at a 10, give the required medicine, right? And then also ask those questions of people who are adhering to those types of standards, right? And so thinking about how do I push the envelope to help people think about how they're internalizing these theories. Remember I was saying these systems are all held by theories? That's one of them, right? This idea that Black people can withstand more pain. Another theory is around, like, there was this old theory around women's emotions are held in their uterus. And the uterus is volatile, like it does so many things. So that's why women are unstable, so they shouldn't be in leadership. And this area was called like hystera or something. It was like a Greek word, hystera. And that's where we get the word hysterical, right? That women are hysterical because it's connected to the hystera or whatever, which was like your uterus. So that sounds very silly now to be like women's feelings are grounded in their uterus. But we have still that theory is still lingering, especially when we're looking at how women are positioned in or not positioned in places of power. So always thinking about, yes, the system is in place, asking yourself a really difficult question about where can I push the envelope? What does that look like and what can I do? And then maybe that means little incremental change, but really focus on what you can do is a great place to start.
Thank you. That's once again another awesome answer. We have someone else who's asking about are microaggressions similar to implicit biases, and they were particularly thinking about comments from traditionalists or baby boomers, so seniors and maybe older people.
Yeah, so in many ways they can overlap for sure. I wouldn't call them the same, but they're definitely cousins, if you will. So if, for example, you're so articulate, right? If you essentially have this bias that you thought that this person was not going to be able to convey this complex concept, then that bias help to shape the action or the words that you shared with the person, right? So, oh, you're so articulate, right? Because I'm letting you know that I didn't think you were going to be. and so when you're thinking about that, the microaggression is essentially can often be seen as the action taken as a result of the implicit bias. So that's definitely a connection there. It's not always, we don't want to make sure we don't want to use those terms interchangeably, but again, they're definitely, they have some strong connections.
Yeah, and I think, just to what you were pointing to is like using those terms to sort of illuminate, help us sort of investigate those situations further rather than just categorize and like put it to a side, like, oh, it's this, it's that, and really systematize it, really just use that language to get us further into that conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so I think the last one that we have here so far is about identity and particularly identity with biracial children. Somebody was asking about, how, if you could talk about how biracial children, particularly, if somebody is biracial but looks white, so if they may be the child of a biracial person and a white person, how might they identify, or what might be those challenges in identification, that way really exploring sort of not just, even though they may look white, to sort of explore all of their identities and be comfortable with that.
Yeah, so the very interesting thing about race is a combination of how you identify and how people identify you, right? So there are people who may identify as Black, but appear white. And so that means they are aware to a degree that they have access to white privilege in ways that people who do not appear as such. So they can say to the world, no, I'm Black, I'm Black, I'm Black, treat me like any other Black person. But unless you're kind of making this announcement, if you will, then that, even if you do, doesn't particularly matter. So I think one way to be thinking about is helping those children understand that there's multiple ways of understanding how they can shape their identity. And what's the most important is how they decide how they're going to identify. Because the world is going to treat them in certain kinds of ways based on how they look, and help them understand that don't give the world all of that power. So when they tell you, oh, you're not Black, you got blue eyes, like you, it's like, you don't get to tell me who I am. And help them with that language very early. Like if they want to identify as I'm biracial, I care as much about as the white side of my family, because that parent is there and I love them dearly, as much as the Black side of my family and that parent, I love them dearly. I identify with both. So you, as a person who is outside of my family, stranger, whatever, you don't get to make that determination. I am both of those things equally, or I've decided to identify with one more than another, and they get to do that, right? And I think the focus has more to do with helping them understand how people may engage them, but really have that strong sense of identity that they get to shape how they are thinking about themselves, so they can have a strong way of going throughout the world.
Hear, 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 hear.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a strong ending point for this very strong presentation. So yeah, on behalf of myself and Lena and all of our participants, I just wanted to extend my thanks again to you, Dr. Crum. This has been just amazing and awesome. And yeah, thank you everybody for attending today. Like we said before, we will have the recording on our social media, so be on the lookout for that. And you have Dr. Crum's contact information, and we'll be sharing that in whatever information we can along with that when we send out the court recording. And otherwise, please visit Mosaic Education Network. And thank you all again, and we'll see you again in another 2 weeks.
Thanks, everybody.
Fantastic. All right, I think